Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm waiting as our attendees join. This is the Hunger for Justice series. This episode is the Revolution of Indigenous Food Systems with Chef Sherman and Dana Thompson of the Sioux Chef and Natives, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. We will be populating the chat box with links to their work, and we'll also be taking questions from the audience during the last 15 minutes of the conversation, so please submit your questions before then. I see a few more attendees are joining, so we're just going to wait a few more minutes before we start. So this session is being recorded. Just again, we will be populating the chat box with links that you could learn more, and we'll also be taking questions from the audience during the last 15 minutes of this conversation. So please submit them before then. A recording of this video will be uploaded for public viewing at the AGC YouTube channel. Thank you all for joining us. A Growing Culture is a nonprofit organization advancing a culture of farmer autonomy and agroecological innovation. We thank you for joining us today. And now some introductory words from the founder of AGC, Lauren Cardelli.
Thank you, Julia. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Hunger for Justice series. This is, I believe, the 11th or 12th broadcast. It's been quite a journey. And what I want to do is take a moment to think about the purpose of this broadcast. Our food system is not just about what you eat, but how you live. And food is a double-edged sword. It can be used as a weapon or as a source of healing. Areas that lack food access are not deserts, but sites of food apartheid. And our system has been designed to produce high-calorie, low-nutrition food. Which has led to the detrimental effects of health and well-being of communities the world over. Food aid has been used to undermine these communities' sovereignty, undercutting local producers and eventually putting them out of business. Government subsidies fuel these initiatives as they are guided by the interests of corporations, not the people. Private property laws and the narratives around rugged individualism have been used as a weapon against collectivism and models around natural resources that view them as a commons. It was in the 1950s, the United States government launched a 20-year campaign to eradicate Native American culture. The goal was to move Native Americans to cities where they would disappear through assimilation into the white mainstream culture, opening the door to the purchasing and development of the Native American reservations. I chose not to put development in quotes because sadly, this is the model of development that plagues the world today. Although this disgusting campaign failed, 2/3 of Native Americans live in cities today. Throughout the Hunger for Justice broadcast, we have tried to bring to the center themes that are paramount to our food system, paramount to agriculture. Themes like sovereignty, autonomy, commoning, decolonization, decentralization, and gender equality. We often fail to recognize that when agriculture became agribusiness, we didn't lose our focus on the environment, but instead gave up the culture. The culture is sacred, and food, seed, and land are the fibers that form its sacred tapestry. The work that Chef Sherman and Dana are doing to celebrate and revitalize Indigenous food culture is of the most paramount importance. I cannot begin to express how honored, grateful, and blessed I feel today to be even able to introduce Dana and Sean. Chef Sean Sherman, the founder of the company, the Sioux Chef, is committed to revitalizing Native American cuisine. Oglala Lakota, born in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, he has been cooking across the US and Mexico over the past 30 years and has become renowned all over the world in the culinary movement of Indigenous foods. His main focus has been on the revitalization and evolution of Indigenous food systems throughout North America. Chef Sean has studied on his own extensively to determine the foundations of those food systems, which include the knowledge of Native American agricultural techniques, wild food usage and harvesting, land stewardship, salt and sugar production, hunting and fishing, food preservation, indigenous oceanography, Native American migrational histories, elemental and seasonal cooking techniques, and Native culture and history in general, to gain a full understanding of bringing back a sense of Native American cuisine to today's world. As co-owner of the company, the Sioux Chef, Dana Thompson, lineal descendant of the Wahpeton Sisseton and lifetime Minnesota native, has been working with the food sovereignty movement for the past 6 years. Within that time, she has traveled extensively throughout tribal communities, engaging in critical ways to improve food access. Together, they founded NATIVS, the North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, where they are working to promote indigenous foodways, education, and increase access to indigenous foods. Reclamation of ancestral education is a critical part of reversing the damage of colonialism and forced assimilation, and food is at the heart of this reclamation. NATIVS will drive sustainable economic empowerment and prosperity into tribal areas through a reimagined North American food system that also addresses the health impacts of injustice, where Dana will focus her expertise on addressing and treating ancestral trauma through decolonized perspectives of honoring and leveraging indigenous wisdom. Without further ado, it is my greatest honor to introduce Dana.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting us to participate in this panel. We're really excited to engage with the community that's here today, so thank each of you for joining us. I am going to ask Sean to give a short presentation or overview of our work, and then we can engage with each other with some questions and just have a nice relaxed conversation.
Great. All right, you guys, I'm going to jump right into it because I have a lot to go through and I want to get through it pretty quickly so we can have some questions and answers and conversations. So I'm going to dump a lot of information on you because usually this presentation can take up to an hour, and I'm going to squeeze it in about 20 minutes. So I'm going to switch screens here in just 2 seconds, and we're going to take it from there. So one moment. All right. So Dana and I have been running the Sioux Chef company that I started in 2014 for quite a few years now. We've had quite a few adventures. We're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are just blocks from where one of our community members, George Floyd, was killed and became national news. And our kitchen, which is called the Indigenous Food Lab, in Minneapolis, is right in the center of where all the rioting happened. So we were surrounded by a lot of buildings that have just been completely burned down. And we've been in the midst of mobilizing our kitchen to help out our community because we lost so many points of grocery stores and food access that we've been doing everything we can. So we've been pushing out 400 meals every single day, 5 days a week to help support our community and anybody in need, a lot of our homeless population and things like that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about our work. I'm going to talk about what our vision is, how do we understand Indigenous food systems, why is it important, and what our vision is for the future of what we can do to benefit all of us by having a deeper understanding of how Indigenous food systems work on a global scale even. So our work with the Sioux Chef really began for myself as a chef growing up, being born and raised on Pine Ridge Reservation, which has been the poorest area of the United States ever since its inception, and just really wanting to do something different. I had worked my entire life in restaurants and tried to really understand. I worked many different kinds of cuisines when I was a younger chef. I learned a lot of Italian and French and Spanish cuisines and then I became interested in other parts of the world. But a few years into my chef career, I had this epiphany of realizing that I knew very little of my own heritage food. So I really wanted to try and understand what that meant, because I realized that I can name hundreds of European recipes and just a handful of Lakota recipes that would have been truly Lakota. So it kind of shot me on a path to really research and understand. So I had to dig through a lot of different kinds of texts and methods to get that understanding. And it took quite a few years, but eventually we were able to start a business that focuses on Indigenous foods. We prioritize hiring Indigenous peoples. We tried to cut out all colonial ingredients just to showcase the bounty and the diversity of the land that we're on. So we are not using any dairy or wheat flour or cane sugar or beef, pork, or chicken, just to showcase other pieces of things that are true to our regions, because those colonial ingredients have not existed in our land spaces for that long, and we wanted to explore what a modern vision of Indigenous foods look like. So to truly understand Indigenous food systems, it was important to kind of put ourselves with that challenge and try to bring foods back to a more true sense of flavor profile and explore them. And we weren't trying to just replicate foods from, say, 1491, but we were trying to understand as much knowledge from our ancestors as possible around foodways and apply that and create a new and kind of an evolved version of Indigenous foods and method of being able to do that. So when we first started and really focused on that, it became a large focus on learning true histories, because we're very seldomly taught the true histories outside of the colonial history, which just basically praises itself. And we wanted to really, and coming especially from a tribal community, we know that there's so much injustice and untruths throughout the histories that we're taught, especially in school systems. My family was all from Pine Ridge Reservation, and the history of that does not go back very far. So I think about just 100 years prior to my birth. I was born in 1974, and 100 years prior to my birth, my Lakota ancestors still retained 100% of their Indigenous education and knowledge that their ancestors had passed down for millennia. So a big question for myself was, how did we lose so much knowledge in such a short time span, in less than a single century? So it really became important, even more important, to understand what these foods that we're playing with, and to talk about things like pre-colonial foods. And I think if you're going to even understand the term pre-colonialism, you really have to just understand what does the term colonialism really truly mean. So just to set us all on the same page, I'd like to just show the definition of the term colonialism so we can start from there. Because colonialism is defined as the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. And this is something that we've seen not only in North America, but across the entire globe, throughout all the Americas, Central, South, North, all of Africa, all of India, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, you name it. Like, the same situation was happening, especially coming from European powers. And we just want people to remember how short of a history that this was, and how damaging this was to Indigenous peoples on a global scale. The United States has never come to terms with how it became this great power by stealing Indigenous lands and utilizing stolen Indigenous families from Africa to build their empires. So there's a lot of reparations that have to be acknowledged moving forward. And I think we're in a good time space where a lot of these conversations are beginning to come to light. But it's important that we have a true sense of these histories, understanding that a lot of this starts with the doctrine of discovery, which basically gives a lot of these European powers the ability to own anything they, quote, discover. So we know that, that method is, it's just so interesting, because that method is still intertwined and deeply into the fabric of what our governance is still today, right? The United States developed its own manifest destiny. So just to focus on where Dana and I are at in the US and in North America, people have to remember how young America is, because if you look at America in the year 1800, when we're just barely a brand new country, in reality, like, all of what is the US is still under Indigenous control, despite European powers having a big holds on large sections of land. So France is holding sections, Spain is holding sections, Great Britain still holding on, Russia is trying to get in there. But during this time period, in the 1800s, is when the US government sets its sights to wipe out indigenous land holding spaces. So during that time period, there's a lot of relocation efforts. There's a lot of active genocide happening. People are being completely wiped off the map. Entire villages and communities are being completely obliterated. And a lot of indigenous communities, especially after the Civil War in the West, are doing their best to hold on to their ways of life, but are falling constantly. And it happens at an extremely, extremely fast rate. And a lot of this is very recent history for so many of us still alive today, because this history is just my great-grandfather's era. My great-grandfather was born in the late 1850s, and during his lifespan sees many battles between the Lakota and the US government, sees the formation of the reservation systems, see the massacre at Wounded Knee, sees his children go through boarding school systems, and eventually even sees some of his children grow up to fight for the US government. So such a huge turn of events for one single person to witness, which many people did. So during this time period, the US government, one of the main ways of accomplishing this was the destruction of our foodways, and it was very focused. George Washington, the first president of the United States, one of his first acts is sending out his General Sullivan to wipe out all the native tribes in the Northeast, especially through New York, which happens during a single summer. And there's reports of General Sullivan burning down 6 mile by 6 mile crops of corn, because the communities that were in that area had such ancient and amazing agricultural systems that had been going on for such a long time. In the West, we see this happening across the United States. And in the West, we see the very focused destruction of the American bison. The United States government did a survey in the 1840s to try and figure out how much bison was out there, knowing that a lot of the tribes in a huge swath from Mexico up through Canada were utilizing this animal for so many pieces, and knowing that by removing this animal, it would hurt a lot of these tribal communities greatly, and they were going to be easier to conquer. So they were actively, during the 1850s and 60s, wiping out this animal. So by the time 1900 comes around, there's less than 500 of these animals alive on the planet. And this is just part of what we went through as indigenous peoples during the 1800s here in North America. But what was most damaging was after the reservation systems are set, after a lot of our tribes are relocated and put onto reservation systems, it's the eradication of our own indigenous education that has hurt us the most. So if you take a moment to identify what is indigenous education compared to Western education, indigenous education is thousands of generations of information being handed down, of basically giving us the blueprint of how to live sustainably, utilizing plants primarily, but also animals of our region, and utilizing traditions and all the pieces of our cultures and stories that teach us those lessons. But during this time period in history, this generation, which is my grandparents' generation, who should have been handed down all of this knowledge and information like their ancestors had millennia before, are forced into assimilation efforts and are forced into boarding schools here in the US, which strips them of their culture, forces them to learn English, forces them to learn religions that have nothing to do with them, and forces them to become something that they're not. And this is an extremely traumatic time period where we're still reeling from the trauma of this situation, because these boarding school systems were militarized and very strict, and these poor kids went through an immense amount of abuses. Many of them died, like huge percentages of them passed away. So if you visit a place like Carlisle, Pennsylvania Indian School, there's a huge graveyard of these children, which is, it's just horrible to see. But these kids also endured a lot of physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, and all this trauma they grow up with and bring with them. And we're still feeling it in a lot of our communities today as a direct result from that time period. And that trauma was something that wasn't really existing within indigenous communities, because indigenous peoples here, and we're not like utilizing corporal punishment against our children. Like we would never think about raising a hand as a way of teaching. So it's just a really important history that we must understand, and that these boarding schools popped up all over the US, they popped up all over Canada, and we're starting to hear a lot of the horror stories of what was going on within these boarding schools and residential schools across North America. And these poor children that had to endure this, which are basically my grandparents and parents' age of children. The boarding schools were still alive and well up until the 1990s, or residential schools in Canada. And again, like if you visit, like, you know, there had these little tiny handcuffs for little tiny hands, and they were keeping kids in cages. And here in America, we are still holding kids captive in cages. So we have not gone very far with all of this racial injustice that is still happening right in front of us today. And this should make a lot of us very angry. During the 1900s was basically a century of invisibility for us. My grandparents were born before they became citizens, so Indigenous peoples weren't even citizens until 1924. Throughout the 1940s and 1960s, like Lauren mentioned, we went through really harsh and intense Indian termination and relocation policies, which have been extremely damaging and traumatic for our urban communities especially. We couldn't vote, as with many different people of color, till the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In places like where I grew up on Pine Ridge, we couldn't vote until the 80s because our South Dakota government wouldn't allow votes from unorganized counties, which would be the Indigenous counties. Within my lifetime, also, we couldn't even celebrate openly our own religions until 1978. So many of our religions, traditions, and ceremonies had to go underground for fear of persecution. And we lost a lot of valuable knowledge by elders who kept quiet out of fear of that persecution. So growing up in post-colonial Native America, a lot of us, especially in the US and Canada, grew up with staples like this. We were far removed from our traditional food systems, and instead forced to rely on government-issued foods, which are high in saturated fats, high in salts, high in sodiums, just high in carbs in general. And it's created an epidemic of health-borne illnesses like type 2 diabetes, where some communities have upwards of 60% type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, you name it. And it's, you know, even for myself growing up, the cans were basically just government issued cans, just like this. And it's a very traumatic when this is our only nutritional source to be raised upon. And then looking at pieces like Indian tacos or fry bread tacos, this has really nothing to do with us as to the identity of us as Indigenous peoples, and it shouldn't identify a large swath of us either, because this is a direct result of being reliant on government food systems and our ancestors figuring out ways to utilize flour, lard, salt, sugar staples to feed our families during really harsh time periods in the 1900s. But we can do so much better. So to truly understand Indigenous food systems, you know, first you just look at diversity. So since we're looking at North America, if you just look at ecoregion diversity, there's all sorts of swamps and mountains and great high plains great basins, coastal regions, Arctic tundras, you name it. There's so much plant and animal diversity across these regions. And then when you layer Indigenous peoples on it, one way to see that is through an Indigenous language map. So if you look at Indigenous language maps today, you can still see how diverse we are. And knowing that these color blocks are also extremely, there's a lot of diversity within those too, because there's many subdialects and even other people intermingled amongst that. And these are very fluid lines. They move around. There's not hard borders like we see in colonial borders today. Today in North America, we still have 634 tribes in Canada, 573 in the US, all of which 229 are in Alaska. 20% of Mexico identifies as Indigenous, and almost 8% of that of the population of the entirety of Mexico still speaks Indigenous languages. So there's an immense amount of Indigenous people and diversity out there today. Side-by-side comparison of Indigenous regions compared to colonial settler states. For us as Indigenous peoples, it does not matter who is speaking Spanish on one side of a dumb border wall, or who is speaking English, or who is speaking French, because those are all colonial languages. And what's more important is to understand the true diversity of the cultures that have existed here for millennia and how they survived. So when we're looking at indigenous food systems, and it's not about culinary, it's about how entire communities were able to sustain themselves for millennia, utilizing all of these lessons through wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, butchery, salt, sugar, fat production, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, regional histories, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, and sustainability. So we take into account all of that to truly understand how an indigenous food system works and how to decolonize the food system anywhere basically we want to study. And for us, the easiest way to do this is to connect with plants and to connect with the natural world around us. So when you start to learn our natural world around us, you start to see so much amazing diversity that the Western food system has never embraced. The Western food system has brought its own foods, its own comfort foods along with it, and adopted very few of the natural wonders that we have here in, again, for us, our study is North America, so here in North America. So we encourage people to get out there and start to learn the names of these plants and the uses of them, because our indigenous ancestors, we had the privilege of having thousands of generations of ancestry, of passing down the knowledge of how to utilize everything, knowing that every plant has a purpose. And every plant is medicine also. Understanding how staples work, understanding like where people were gathering large pieces of staples from the wild and tending the wild and protecting our natural resources. Here in Minnesota, we are lucky to have something like this wild rice, which is this whole lake, right? But we've destroyed so many of its waterways. And it's really important to understand why indigenous peoples are standing up for water rights and trying to keep big oil pipelines from crossing through these really delicate waterways that is a source of so much food and culture for so many of us when it comes down to it. Because these pieces have been keeping our families alive and healthy forever. And other water plants like ocean plants, our indigenous ancestors knew exactly how to utilize those pieces for food and medicine also, or in the desert. Like Lauren said, it's silly to use a term like food desert because people who lived in the desert, all they saw was food around them, and they knew exactly how to harvest, when to harvest, which parts to harvest, and how to harvest sustainably without damaging these really closely related plant species that are our relatives, because they knew from generational knowledges to be able to work with them. Proteins, I think, is the easiest piece because any animal moving around, but a big lesson out of this is how we learn about how indigenous peoples were able to utilize so many parts of the animals for everything and finding a use for everything. But that's because we did not have the privilege to be wasteful, and we had to be resourceful with absolutely everything we had. And we had thousands of generations of knowledge of how to be resourceful. Whereas in today's world, we are the most wasteful species on the planet right now. And we need to do so much better. And there's so many lessons we can learn from indigenous peoples on a global scale and how to become more resourceful. But we should not be afraid of proteins if it doesn't happen to be a cow, a pig, or a chicken, because basically every critter moving around could possibly be a sustainable source of protein if we're able to manage them correctly. Whether it's fish or shellfish or even insects, which should be so normalized even in North America and not looked down upon because it's such a normal situation and such a highly sustainable source of protein for us. A native agriculture needs to have much more information written and talked about, because we live in a world where we think this is agriculture, and we know that this is damaging because we know how much chemical is being utilized to put into this form of agriculture, knowing that these chemicals are getting into our soil, bleeding into our waterways, bleeding into our community, and getting into our own bodies. So when we see titles like "How worried should we be that glyphosate was found in our Cheerios?" everybody should be really worried, because that just basically makes us lab rats, and to see what happens to us after we consume high amounts of chemicals like glyphosate, and what is that gonna do to us physically, personally, and as a community. So to truly understand North American and American indigenous agriculture, you have to think way back. And it's amazing that it hasn't been talked about as much as it should be, because people have figured out the corn culture situations, which spread both north and south. So corn culture spreads all the way through Mexico, all the way up the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, deep into areas like where we are in Minnesota, all the way throughout the Caribbean and up the East Coast and everywhere in between those regions, basically bringing with it products like corns, varieties of beans, squash, chili peppers, sunflower seeds, tobacco, and there's just so much history out of it. And people had figured out so many different styles of farming techniques, like the floating gardens down in Mexico, where Mexico City is now, or waffle systems in the southwest part of the United States, where people figured out how to farm for thousands of years in the middle of the desert, which is an amazing human feat. People know a lot about these three sisters systems, where the corns, the beans, and the squash grow together so well, because the corn grows, the beans grow up the corn, and the squash protects the cover. But this was a very particular style of farming, as there were many, because again, we're so diverse. This is a picture of Buffalo Bird Woman, a Hidatsa woman in North Dakota at the turn of the century, right along the Missouri River Valley. And she's using more of a row system, but growing the same pieces as our Aztec and our Mayan families and indigenous families deep in Mexico are utilizing too. So it's important to think about the spread of those agricultural pieces, knowing that each one of these diverse seeds comes from very particular people with deep storylines. And we're lucky that we've been able to preserve and save these seeds, because we have to be the stewards of these seeds for the next generation. Our generation today has to understand the importance of saving these seeds and saving these diversities, to making sure that our future generations have access to these seeds also. Otherwise, they're all going to be bought up by corporations, hoarded, and we cannot let that happen. We need to maintain localized food diversity all over the place. There's just so much that we can be learning from this, but we have to be active in being stewards of this diversity that's still out there today. So reclaiming Indigenous health and culture through food has been our main focus as our company, trying to pay homage to our ancestors and learn as much as we can from them, from the ways that they preserved foods, from the ways that grew food and processed foods, and really understanding what is Indigenous food sovereignty and food security. We need healthy food access, cultural food producers, regional food systems, local control and non-governmental control of our food systems, access to Indigenous education, and strong environmental protections that as local environmental protections on top of that. So we started a company where we just started utilizing this knowledge on a daily basis, teaching our staff to identify and to utilize the natural world around us, using technology to be able to identify things, because nowadays you can just take a picture of a plant, and being able to just open our eyes up and see the world for what it is, and see how Mother Nature is giving us so much food and medicine no matter where we look. It's so important that as Indigenous peoples, we have a moment to define our own food systems and what our own foods are. Taking the time to define and create our own pantry, utilizing dried herbs and pieces, and creating food and spices and mixes that taste exactly like where we are. And just being able to give a lot of Indigenous peoples a chance to work and be creative and grow this kind of foods, to create businesses around it. Like for us, like I said, we cut out all colonial ingredients and be able to create successful businesses around these pieces, and making food taste, again, just like where you are, utilizing the world around you like our ancestors did. Having fun with it and putting artistry into these is a great way to showcase these foods. But the simplicity of the foods is what's most important, and getting these foods and making sure that our Indigenous communities are having access to these foods, especially our elders and our youth. It's going to be so important that we create systems for them to have access to these foods. So with that in mind, that's how we came up with our method of helping to design Indigenous culinary infrastructure by creating our nonprofit NATIVS, which is North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems is the acronym, with the sole purpose of creating access to Indigenous education and creating access to Indigenous foods. So basically taking the two pieces that colonialism used against us and the United States governments, and rebuilding our Indigenous education and rebuilding our access to our own traditional foods. And it's just going to be so important. So this year, Dana and I are opening up Indigenous Food Lab, which is going to be starting here in Minneapolis, with the sole purpose of creating a commercial kitchen that can be utilized for training and education. We're going to be creating an educational studio where we can be pumping out a ton of curriculum on Indigenous food topics that can be easily shared with people all over the world if they want to learn, and centering ourselves to be a resource for Indigenous food knowledge, so people can tap into our websites, come and visit us when it's safe to do so. And our goal is to work directly with tribal communities in our vicinity and region, helping them to design a commercial kitchen for their own community that's focused on healthy Indigenous foods, that can, and hopefully impacting them to design these foods to be about their culture, their religion, their history, their land space, and creating each one to be just slightly unique to the other ones. We envision a world where we can drive across North America in any direction, stopping at Indigenous focused food businesses and starting to see and celebrate the amazing cultural and nutritional diversity that we have across the board. And hopefully influencing these communities to be able to grow community gardens, to think about landscape design. Lawns are stupid, so we should be developing permacultural systems. If we can develop if we can maintain 30 golf courses in Palm Springs in the middle of the desert, think how much good we can do if we were able to just place food plants everywhere for communities to utilize, and kitchens that would be able to process these foods and were trained and had the skills to be able to maintain utilizing traditional Indigenous foods. People can check out our cookbook that we utilize as an educational piece because it has over 100 recipes using only Indigenous food pieces of our region. And also, you know, we're just going to be putting a ton of effort into developing Indigenous education for people to utilize of all ages, for people to learn. And we want to also give the opportunity to people to help create more Indigenous food producers, because we're going to be continuously developing in demand, and we want to help more people to create small entrepreneurship business programs so they can help us grow these food production pieces. If we can control our food, we can control our destiny, just like our Indigenous ancestors have done. Our final goal is to open up Indigenous food labs in areas all over North America, each one becoming a regional center point for training, education, development, and support of all the Indigenous communities in its vicinity. Then we can see that goal of being able to travel across North America, visiting all of these Indigenous food businesses. And it opens us up to be able to have conversations about cultural appropriation, especially here in North America, where all of these pieces have been way too normalized. And I know the tide is changing, and it's such an important time, and we need to keep up on this and not let this slide, because these are damaging images that have nothing to do with us, and nor does it talk about the struggles and the hardships that our Indigenous communities had to go through. And the last thing we need is our image to be utilized to make millions for somebody as a marketing gimmick, you know? So this is an Indigenous evolution and revolution at the same time for us. And it's all about these future generations. It's not even about our generation. It's about setting up this next generation of kids so they have the infrastructure to know where their foods will be accessible, knowing that they have education to their traditional ways, and knowing that they can take this knowledge and do something even bigger with it in the future. And eventually, hopefully, we can do this on a global scale. Hopefully, we can open up Indigenous food labs in countries all over the globe, helping to decolonize on a mass scale everywhere we can, because we truly believe that the future and the way for all of us is Indigenous, and we need to get there. All right, I'm going to stop there. I tried to get through that as fast as I could. I'm going to get back to the video. There we are.
So, Sean, I'm going to start by asking you a couple questions. When I was invited to participate in this panel, it was really exciting for me because I've seen Sean's presentation maybe 1,000 times. And I still get emotional every time I see it. And there's always so much more to learn, because we have what I call multiple lifetimes worth of work ahead of us. And so it's not lost on me looking at the image of Buffalo Bird Woman and talking about how rare that text is and how much knowledge was lost. But the first time I met you, Sean, I heard your original vision in 2014, and my first thought was, this is a feminist issue. So I want you to talk a little bit about how important it is to cultivate that female perspective.
Well, I think, you know, gender roles are extremely important for Indigenous peoples, and many of our Indigenous communities had a spectrum of gender roles available for two-spirited people, for female, for male. And I think it's really important to understand how those played out in the past. But I think books like Buffalo Bird Woman is such a unique situation because not only is it a unique Indigenous perspective on agriculture pre-colonial, of truly understanding how a community way up in North Dakota was able to preserve their memories of farming and seed saving and all of their techniques before they ever saw European people, but also it's coming from an Indigenous female voice, which is so rarely recorded in history at all. You know, so rarely do female voices ever make it into history books, let alone an Indigenous voice from a female. So there's just a lot of importance to that because the females, especially in some of these farming communities, are doing a lot of the work of seed saving, of just doing all the farming and agriculture when it came down to it. So much knowledge and tradition was passed down to them generation after generation. But it is equally important for all the other gender roles too as it comes down. But it's, you know, it's very important.
When I look at the inflammation that we see showing up in foodborne illnesses and as a sort of a form of destruction, when you look at the colonial ingredients, it always reminds me that that comfort food, like lasagna, for instance, is sort of emotional eating. Mm-hmm. So getting away from those inflammatory foods, tell me, I know what my perspective is about it, but I want to hear it from you. How do you see food as a mechanism for healing trauma?
Well, I really truly believe that we're in a unique time space right now with this global pandemic. I think that it's really shown us how vulnerable we are by being overly reliant on industrialized and over-processed food systems. And the importance of understanding localized and regional food systems, I think, is even more so important right now. You know, and anybody with a healthy diet, like, you know, an Indigenous diet, basically anywhere, is going to be extremely healthy. And you're going to be able to find evidence of that when you look for it. You know, because it's a low glycemic diet. There's a lot of fatty acids that are so good for you. There's a lot of healthy proteins, an immense amount of plant diversity compared to the Western diet. And it's just so localized, obviously. And it's like so perfect. It's basically what the paleo diet wishes it could be, you know, but it's so diverse, you know, in that too. And I think that if you're eating healthy, like, you know, all of this nutrient and all this micronutrient that's getting into us, staying away from over-processed foods is going to do anybody well. And especially, like, you know, it's for our mental states, you know, because our brain is not disconnected from our body, obviously. And what we eat will truly affect us. So we need to have access to healthier foods. If all we have access to is non-nutritional foods, like what I had to grow up with the commodity food program, we have plenty of data of what happens to entire communities when that's their main source of nutrition. So it's not only affecting them on a physical and health level, but also extremely on mental levels also. So there's a lot more work that will come around of showcasing how we are, obviously our brain is connected to our body and our mental state is directly connected to the foods that we eat.
I've got another question, but I want to make sure that the audience understands that they're able to ask questions here, and it's going to be moderated by someone else. Is it Lauren? Sean, when I look at that ecoregion map, mm-hmm. It really it's fun for me to look at the overlay of the original language maps of the area of all of North America. Mm-hmm. How does that inspire you to reach our ultimate vision, which is to create access for Indigenous foods all over North America?
Well, I think it's extremely doable because all we're doing is creating commercial kitchens that can produce food in mass that is completely dedicated to serving only healthy Indigenous food, primarily of its region, supporting localized Indigenous food producers as much as possible and prioritizing purchasing from localized Indigenous food producers, but also utilizing non-Indigenous food producers to be able to bring in a lot of healthy vegetable product, protein, and things like that, and just supporting our local food system over everything else. Because like for us, we don't even utilize any of the big box trucks, you know, and the big food corporations. We stopped using those years and years ago, well before I even started the Sioux Chef. But it's so important to utilize and figure out what to do with local food. And also for us, we just unapologetically only serve healthy indigenous food, and we do our best to make it beautiful, tasty, and obviously it's going to be healthy and make us feel good, you know. And we feel like we can mimic this and replicate this model and just get that out there everywhere. But it's an education issue, which is why we're creating educational kitchens to teach people how to produce foods so we can all learn how to eat in this manner. So we open it up to some questions.
Yep, I can keep going if I could go all day.
Does anybody from A Growing Culture want to moderate some questions for us, or should we just pick and choose?
I think that yeah.
Here we go.
What are the ways in which you have seen climate change affect the production of indigenous crops and seeds?
Well, I think as indigenous peoples who are farmers, who are gatherers, whatever we're doing, we have this unique and deep connection with nature, and we're able to just monitor the changes that are coming and see the climate change for what it is. But also as indigenous peoples, we have been very resilient. We have been extremely adaptable, but there are some pieces out of our control, with corporations buying up water rights, for example, with loss of land or loss of access to water. There's going to be a lot of issues that we're going to have to face. There's going to be a lot of protections around indigenous farming and agriculture and communities that we're going to have to fight for. And there's going to be a lot of issues coming up, but we're going to have to basically, you know, join together to be one strong voice to make sure that we can do our best to roll with these changes, basically, and to be able to overcome them eventually. But we're going to have to be adaptive, and we're going to have to be resilient. But I think it's proven over and over again that that's one of the strongest qualities of indigenous peoples everywhere.
Absolutely true. What are some of the apps that you use for plant ID?
Oh, I always use this one called
Picture This.
And I know there's another one. Leaf Snap, I think, is another one.
Yep.
Yep.
Is it Plant Snap or Leaf Snap?
Plant Snap, I can't remember,
it's
but it's pretty easy to find them out there, and they're pretty handy to have because we have these little computers in a lot of our pockets, and we should be utilizing that for for good, not just for angry tweets, but for trying to get closer and using it for the tools that they are.
And Sean, since we've been using those applications over the last year, I believe that they've been improving.
Yeah, it's because it's growing constantly,
Yeah.
and the more people that use them, the better that they get, obviously. So they're well designed, and we ourselves are hoping to design some apps for people to help understand indigenous foodways better too in the future. So keep an eye on some of our efforts as we grow out the Indigenous Food Lab.
With the depth, breadth, and severity of colonial damage done, how can we start to envision and realize a just system of reparations? What would that look like?
Well, I think a lot of these conversations are coming out strongly right now, and obviously there's going to be a lot of resistance. So taking down statues like Christopher Columbus, for example, is a great step in the right direction, obviously, and opening up conversations of why it is damaging to be celebrating Confederate pieces out there into communities that had suffered so much under those forces, basically. Or for us, like I'm from Pine Ridge, where we're basically our homeland and our most spiritual place are the Black Hills in South Dakota, which has been highly contested because they were illegally stripped from us as Lakota people because of the Treaty of 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty. And during the 1980s, there was a Supreme Court ruling, U.S. versus the Sioux Indians over the Black Hills, which the U.S. lost. And the U.S. Was forced to give an offer of, I don't remember if it was 10 million back then. 100 million, I can't remember, but it's well over $1 billion right now. My tribe has refused to accept payment for the Black Hills because that was never the point. The Black Hills were never for sale. And we have the colonial structures of Mount Rushmore, which is basically a giant colonial middle finger to the Lakota, of these very oppressive figures who each of them have done an immense amount of damage to indigenous peoples. And, you know, I believe structures like this are extremely damaging, and the true histories of who these people really were should be really talked about and not celebrated in some blind patriotic way, right? So it's interesting because our president is at Mount Rushmore today celebrating and continuing this colonial presence. If I could, I would be out there protesting that right now.
Yeah, our illegitimate president.
Well, anyways, that's our opinion.
Okay. Marketing and distribution can often be challenging for new food entrepreneurs. Can you speak to the approaches to address these challenges for Indigenous entrepreneurs?
I think there's a lot of support out there for people of color and starting businesses, obviously. But, you know, we're trying to really focus on development of healthy Indigenous foods and marketing. You know, we've, as far as our team has gone, we have pretty much primarily just used social media as a marketing tool, but we've also been blessed that we've had a lot of attention with the media, and we've been able to get our vision and our voice out there pretty widespread, and also just been very articulate with our concerns and our vision also to be able to, you know, have magazine articles and being able to write the cookbook and get that out there. But we want to, you know, as we create this vision of helping to spread Indigenous food businesses and kitchens all over the place, we'll be creating a network and a distribution system, basically, where we're hoping that we can help plug people into our systems. So eventually, again, like, it's unfortunate that we live in a world where if you visit any food capital of the US, like Manhattan or Chicago or LA, you're not going to find any Indigenous restaurants that focus on the land that they're standing on. And then we need to change that drastically. And we need to figure out systems of how can we trade Indigenous foods amongst ourselves and get Indigenous foods to communities that need it the most. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it's an issue that we are definitely thinking about a lot and hoping to create some answers to.
Absolutely. And I want to add to that, that frankly, we've worked really hard to increase our social media presence, specifically knowing that once we launch the Indigenous Food Lab and we start trying to develop these entrepreneurs, we're going to use our platform to spread awareness and to help sort of lift them all up.
Right. Next question. Good.
Where can we go to learn about, one, what foods are local to our specific areas, and two, the history of Indigenous communities in our areas?
Well, if you want to learn about what foods are local to your area, I would suggest going outside first. And, you know, I just really, I encourage people to start to learn the plants around them. I always tease that our kids can name off more Kardashians than tree species. You know, I know that joke's getting old, but
it's pretty funny still.
But, you know, it's true. And like, we need to really think about what's important and what are we teaching our children. If we taught them what the plants are, what the trees are, and the uses of all these pieces around us, they're going to see nothing but food and medicine and carrying that with them their entire lives, you know. And the history of Indigenous communities in our areas, I always suggest that people just read Roxanne Dunbar Ortz's book, The Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, as a great starting place. And there's many books out there, but I think Roxanne does such a great job of breaking down the history of colonial destruction in the United States and basically describing how the U.S. military force is created out of all that too. So it's a pretty good essay and really powerful. So I suggest those two pieces.
Super relevant to the police brutality and the militarization of our police right now, especially in regards to George Floyd. So.
Yeah. How can those outside of the Indigenous communities help and support? How can we help preserve Native cultures? Well, we need obviously supporting any Native efforts around foodways, Native efforts, especially around protection of natural resources, standing and being allies with a lot of the environmentalists and water protectors that are out there, because that's our future livelihood, you know. if they put up, you know, like there's all these battles constantly with big oil here in Minnesota as they're trying to lay pipelines through our traditional indigenous lands and our wild rice beds. And one single leak could damage those lakes for, who knows, hundreds of years. It depends on how the severity of it. But even a small leak can be extremely damaging for decades, you know? And it's just something that we have to think about. How can we better help and preserve our natural resources? So it's really just standing with us, and as we go through some of these social injustice fights on environment, on just in social injustice in general when it comes down to it, you know. So there's a lot of, obviously, there's a lot of pieces out there. So I encourage you guys to learn more about whatever community you might be in, whatever region you might be in, and any Indigenous efforts that might be out there, and seeing how you can support those. Oh, all right. So yeah, if you guys want to follow us, of course, we have a lot of videos and information on our Sioux Chef website. We are just beginning a lot of our work around our nonprofit NATIVS, which again is the acronym North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. And look for us at Indigenous Food Lab also, which is the model that we're creating.
Thank you guys so much. That was incredible. I can't wait to watch it multiple more times and really digest all that information that was shared with us. I think something that came up in my mind was during our Juneteenth broadcast, Matthew Rayford, the host, he said, "We don't need any damn allies anymore, we need accomplices." And I think what's really important from that is to think about how every one of us can be accomplices and be supportive of these efforts. You know, when we go to these conferences talking about food systems and there aren't Indigenous voices, there aren't people of colors present, what we should stand up and demand that they're included, that it's centered on. Like, how can you talk about an American food system without including other perspectives, you know? And I think to think that the food movement isn't as guilty as others of this kind of bias and racism is absurd. So I really want to encourage everyone listening today to evaluate how they can best support these efforts. And that's not by standing in front, it's by supporting them and standing alongside, as Sean said. Thank you so much, Sean and Dana, for sharing your stories, for that unbelievable lesson that is just needed, and that should be a part of every young student's curriculum. I want to give you both a chance before we wrap up to share some closing thoughts.
Sure.
Whoever wants to start. Yeah, go ahead.
Closing thoughts. I would just say that we're really humbled by the platform that we have, and we don't take it lightly at all. And we work really hard to make sure that we can do as much good as possible in the short amount of time we have left on this planet, about half of a lifetime, if everything goes as well as we can. So we need all the support that we can from everyone, and we do need allies. And just want to thank you guys all for participating.
And I just want to, get people to really think about the land that we're currently standing on, and the efforts that are out there of having better understanding. Dana and I have been really close with our park board here in Minneapolis, and there's a cool program that we're doing where we help them to basically be able to put a lot of the indigenous names of the plants on some of these walking tour gardens, just so people would see, first off, the Dakota name of the plants, which is the land that we're on right now, on Dakota land, and then the English, and then the Latin, because the plants, those are their original names right here. So even small projects like that, but encouraging more people to learn about natural food systems, learning about Indigenous cultures and learning about the true histories, and a lot of the damaging monuments that are still around us today. What do those really mean, and how can we make those stories better for and more equitable for all of us as in the future? I think we are moving in the right direction slowly. I think that this pandemic is going to help us reset a little bit, but we really have to be focused on making sure that everybody has access to nutritional food, no matter what. That's going to be how we survive as a human race.
I also just see a lot of questions here, and I'm going to try to go through and answer as many as I can. I'm not sure how much time you're going to have to do that, though, because Sean has to run straight back to the kitchen.
Oh, yeah, we're still feeding lots of people every day. But yeah, Dana can stay on and answer a couple questions if you want to, I suppose. Okay. But I think the platform's shutting down at 11.
Is it? I don't know.
So, yeah. Lauren, you guys are.
No, we can hold for some questions, of course. Yeah.
Okay. There's about 10 that I think we can answer quickly.
Perfect.
Okay. You can keep talking if you want while I type, Sean.
Oh, well, we can just address them really fast.
Oh, okay.
Let's just run down the list. If whoever wants to stay on and listen to a few more questions that were typed out, we'll try and get through these, and then I'm going to have to bounce and get back to my kitchen. But what are the ways in which you have seen climate change affect the production of Indigenous crops and seeds? I think that, the biggest change has been colonialism by stripping us from a lot of our lands, the burning of a lot of seeds, the destruction of a lot of crops, and even, you look at the mass destruction of the churro sheep at the Dene down in the Southwest, and there's many atrocities that you find across the board. Climate change itself, just like Indigenous peoples, the seeds can be resilient also. And it's really going to be more of an access to water and land space that's going to be the most effective way to combat that. But
if you look at wild rice, wasn't it all the way across the whole north to the northeast?
Yeah, I mean, at one point it was found all the way out towards New York, but we barely have it, mostly in Minnesota, northern Minnesota at the most, and then parts of Wisconsin and kind of around Lake Superior, really mostly, some in Michigan. But there's just a lot of concerns around that. But again, we're going to have to be resilient and adaptive when it comes to climate change. Do you think that fusion cooking is helpful or hurtful? I think as long as food has a story, that's where it's at. I think cooking should be fun for people. If you want to experiment, if you want to play with, we weren't even fusionizing Indigenous foods. We were just trying to create dishes that really represented one space, But, cooking should be fun. So making a fusion of food, if you want some kimchi and wild rice, then go for it,
And, the reason that we've stuck to a really disciplined approach of eliminating all of the colonial ingredients is really just an act of resistance, and to show that it's possible.
Yeah, and and plus it's just the less footprint, the less carbon footprint you have by utilizing a local food system, the better is when it comes down to it. So try and use local products, but have fun with it. Have fun cooking. Everybody should have fun cooking. Let's see. I imagine for folks a challenge when supporting Indigenous food systems, accessibility. What are some suggestions for people to prioritize supporting Indigenous food systems and productions? And I think we kind of went over some of that a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think for us, we prioritize purchasing from Indigenous food producers as much as possible. If you go to our Sioux Chef website, there's a few links to some Indigenous food producers. And there's other lists out there too, but I would suggest, supporting those, purchasing from Indigenous vendors when you find them online, and just learning how to utilize the food, right?
And we're going to try to set up a pipeline to make these Indigenous foods more accessible as well. That's one of our key goals over the next 12 months. So look for that. And
somebody's asking about if this presentation's online. There are iterations of it. It does evolve because it is our own evolution and revolution too.
Yeah.
So you can, if you, just look for us, search for us online and some videos, you're going to find a ton of videos out there. And there are a few instances of the presentation being out there with everything. Somebody said, I live in urban center in the Pacific Northwest, wondering how difficult it is to access Indigenous food ingredients in cities. How do you source your ingredients? Are they and again, it depends on where you are. We do have friends out there in the Pacific Northwest there are Indigenous food producers out there. Again, they're harder to find sometimes, but once you plug in, and we're hoping to help develop more and more, you know. So it might take a little time for all areas to find local Indigenous food production, but you know, it's going to be one of our biggest efforts with our nonprofit to help see that through in a fairly new future. Our families on Pine Ridge shifting their diet towards Indigenous foodways. There's quite a few different entities working really hard to help promote a healthier diet. And we're hoping that we can get an Indigenous food lab in South Dakota as fast as we can to directly impact a lot of those tribes, especially for me, because that's my home area. So really want to see that through too. Thank you for mentoring links between mental health and nutrition. I'm curious, any work being done with disabled community in your outreach or own organization in relation to access, ready-to-eat meals, etc. That's kind of what we're doing at this very moment, because our 400 meals a day are going to a charter school that's predominantly Hispanic and Latino and Native American, and it's going to their families. There's a lot of elderly centers that our food's going to. We're supporting a lot of our homeless encampments, which have really grown exponentially this year because of COVID, because of the rioting. And we're doing everything we can to try and get food out to people that really need it. And we're just going to be there as a response kitchen, basically from here on, to help support food access needs within our community, and train people how to do that for themselves also. I have the opportunity to influence what will be grown on a biodynamic farm. What resources do you recommend to ID Indigenous plants? I can advocate to be grown, and resources for seeds. There are a lot of Indigenous seeds out there. I sit on the board with Seed Savers Exchange, and you are able to buy some Indigenous seeds directly from their website. We like to try and be very careful. There is an Indigenous Seed Keepers Network out there who supports getting seeds out to Indigenous communities, because again, there is worry that people will try and appropriate Indigenous seeds and put them and market them for their own good. And we really want to see these seeds maintain their stories and their value within Indigenous communities and help to feed Indigenous communities. So we just have very clear and careful conversations with non-Indigenous peoples who are taking on growing out Indigenous seeds, and what that responsibility means for people who do that. Do you have any advice from those of us in countries in Europe who are engaged in food activism, where we know there were once vibrant local cultures and tribes who had their own locally specific beliefs and practices around food? How can we help recover these? Basically, it's just understanding how we can continue to further localize our foodways and really utilize the natural world around us, utilizing that Indigenous perspective of this natural world and reconnecting with the nature, and really making an effort to be much less wasteful, more resourceful, more localized, when it comes down to it. Let's see. Thank you for answering for the outreach you're doing. I'll link you to our resources with food waste and disability so we can shine a light on the work. Brightest of blessings. Thank you guys. Well, thank you guys very much. I think that kind of wrapped up those questions as much as we can. If people want to learn more, again, please go to our websites. Please pick up our cookbook if you want to. And if you want to support us, you can go to our nonprofit website, natifs.org, natifs.org, or come visit us in Minneapolis when it's safe to do so.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Everyone, please go check out their websites and support them. This is really important work, and we need to stand together united. Makes me think that, we're not part of the food chain, we're food chained. And we're really part of a food web. And supporting the farmers, bringing together food cultures, supporting producers and growers, and the infrastructure, that's a food web, and that's what's necessary. And industrial ag has really tried to destroy that into a centralized chain of control. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Sean. This has just been an honor. We've been getting messages left and right that this is just an incredible episode. So thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Our pleasure.
Thanks so much for having us. We're really grateful.
Awesome. Well, everyone, please tune in next week. It's Crowdfunding Food Sovereignty with Joe Jandai, an amazing farmer in Thailand who has decentralized finance in a way of bringing together 6,000 shareholders to revolutionize and fund a new model for nation food sovereignty. It's incredible, resisting banks and VC capital. He's an inspiration of mine, and I can't wait for him to share his story. And finally, guys, thank you to our sponsors, Milgram and Dascom, legal counsel, as well as Eat Your Way Clean. Please tune in next week. Please support the broadcast if possible. And we look forward to this journey together. Thank you, everyone.